Think your life is tough? Try surviving a single day in the Middle Ages. Spoiler, you wouldn't make it to sundown. We've gotten soft. Our climate-controlled homes, drive-through dinners, and streaming TV have made sure of that. But back in medieval times, daily life was a brutal obstacle course, and it started with what you put in your mouth. Let's talk food, if you could even call it that. Forget everything you've seen in movies. There were no banquet tables piled high with roasted turkey legs for regular folks. That was noble fantasy. For the average peasant, meals were a sad parade of mushy, bland, barely edible slop. The main dish? Something called pottage, basically a gray, watery stew of vegetables boiled into submission. It cooked for days in the same crusty pot, flavored by dirt, bugs, and hope. Think of your mom's worst leftover stew. Now add weevils. And bread. Oh, bread. It was the staple of every meal, but don't expect soft, sliced loaves. Medieval bread was heavy, dark, and filled with surprises. The flour was ground between stone wheels, which meant little rock shards often made it into the dough. People chewed so hard they practically sanded their own teeth down. And here's the truly terrifying part. Much of the bread was poisoned. Yep, poisoned. A toxic fungus called ergot grew on rye, and no one knew. It caused hallucinations, burning sensations, even death. Some historians think ergot poisoning led entire towns into witch hunt frenzies because everyone was tripping, not cursed. That crazy neighbor? Probably just your baker. As for meat, it was a rare luxury. When peasants did get some, it was often on the edge of spoiled. No refrigeration meant you either masked the smell with spices, if you were rich, or just held your breath and hoped the mold didn't kill you. The 5-second rule? Try 5 days. And don't think you could wash that nasty meal down with a nice cup of water. That would just kill you faster. Water sources were riddled with human waste, dead animals, and bacteria. So what did people drink? Instead, beer. Lots of it. Even the kids. Since the brewing process killed most of the germs, ale became the drink of choice. But it wasn't the strong stuff we sip today. It was a weak, cloudy brew known as small beer. Still, the average peasant knocked back around 8 pints a day. Even children as young as 5 drank ale with breakfast. In medieval times, you didn't need a fake ID to get a drink. You needed one to get clean water. Just when you thought the food was the worst part, wait until nature calls. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as private, sanitized bathrooms. For the average person, going to the bathroom meant squatting over a chamber pot, a glorified bowl or bucket stashed under the bed. And when it was full, you either dumped it out yourself or waited for someone else to. And by dumped, we mean right out the window. Yes, people in medieval towns regularly tossed their waste into the streets. Before throwing, they'd shout, "Gardez-vous," a warning borrowed from French meaning, watch out for the water. But let's be honest, it wasn't water. It was a surprise from above, and it hit hard. This disgusting ritual was so common that cities had rules. You could only fling your waste after 10 p.m. Because nothing says bedtime like human sewage flying from second-story windows. And if you were wealthy or lucky enough to visit a castle, you might experience the infamous garderobe, basically a stone bench with a hole in it, built into the castle wall. Waste dropped straight down, sometimes as far as 70 feet, collecting in a pile no one wanted to be near. Royalty may have sat on thrones, but those thrones still had drafty holes in them. Couldn't wait to get home. Tough luck. Public areas had designated spots where people would relieve themselves, creating open sewers right in the middle of town. In London, they had places called common privies built over rivers, but they were few, far between, and no less disgusting. Then there were the true heroes of the medieval city, gong farmers. Their job? Collect the human waste from cesspits and transport it outside the city walls. They worked at night. Why? Because the stench was so vile, they weren't allowed in public places during the day. Imagine smelling so bad you're banned from crowds. But oddly enough, gong farmers were paid 4 times more than regular laborers. Not bad, if you didn't mind smelling like hell for a living, and don't even think about toilet paper. It didn't exist. People used whatever was on hand, leaves, moss, their left hand, or if they were rich, scraps of wool or hemp. The Romans had once used sponges on sticks dipped in vinegar, but that hygiene hack was long forgotten by medieval times. So picture it. You're drunk on weak ale, avoiding poisonous water, with no plumbing, and a bowl of someone's leftovers simmering under your bed. Still think you could survive a day? We're just getting started. If you think your 9 to 5 is exhausting, medieval folks would like a word, with their calloused hands and broken backs. For most people, there were no careers, just survival. Nearly everyone was a peasant farmer, toiling on land owned by nobles. There were no vacations, no sick days, just a never-ending loop of wake up at dawn, work until sunset, collapse, and repeat. What did that work look like? Start with plowing fields using wooden tools, dragging, then with oxen, planting seeds by hand, then harvesting with dull, crooked sickles. During peak harvest, peasants worked 16-hour days in blazing heat, burning over 4,000 calories a day, without protein shakes or protein, period. No gym memberships needed, just the will to not starve. If you weren't farming, your alternatives were not much better. Blacksmiths spent their days choking on smoke and hammering red-hot metal, risking burns and blindness. Tanners, who made leather, worked with a stew of animal hides, urine, and toxic chemicals, turning their skin yellow, and their smell radioactive. Once a tanner, always unwelcome at dinner. Want to master a craft? Start early. Apprenticeships began at age 7. Yes, 7. You'd leave your family to live with a master craftsman, working 6 or 7 days a week for up to 14 years before you were considered skilled enough to earn a decent wage. Medieval career advice was simple. Can you lift heavy things? Great. You're a farmer. Can't? Sorry. Early death. And then there were jobs so awful, only the desperate applied. Link boys, usually children, were hired to walk beside wealthy people at night, carrying torches to light the path. Basically, human flashlights. And pure finders. Their job was collecting dog feces off the street to sell to tanners. That's right, scooping poop was a legitimate side hustle. As for the pay, laughable. A day laborer might earn 1 or 2 pennies, just enough for a couple loaves of bread. That's it. No savings, no safety net, just barely enough to not drop dead. Minimum wage? No such concept. It was more like minimum effort, maximum suffering. And with every blistered hand and every aching back, one truth became clear. Medieval life didn't care about your dreams. It only cared whether you could make it to tomorrow. If the brutal labor didn't wear you down, the diseases absolutely would. Medicine in the Middle Ages was more superstition than science, and getting sick was like spinning a death roulette wheel. The common cold could kill you. A fever might be your last night. And the so-called doctors? They were winging it with knives and leeches. Why? Because nobody knew about germs. They believed illness came from bad air or imbalances in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. You didn't need a diagnosis, you just needed to bleed. Bloodletting was the go-to cure. Feeling dizzy? Let's drain your veins. Headache? Slice you open. Your body hurts? Great, let's make you lose a pint of blood and see what happens. It was medieval logic. You're dying? Maybe you just have too much blood. And if cutting wasn't enough, they'd call in the leeches, tiny vampires applied to your skin to suck out the bad blood. Some doctors recommended using 70 leeches at once. At that point, the leeches were getting better health care than you. The numbers were horrific. Around 30% of children died before they even hit age 5. The average life expectancy? Somewhere between 30 and 40 years, assuming you dodged plagues, starvation, and axe wounds. Speaking of plagues, the Black Death wiped out half of Europe's population in the 14th century. Imagine waking up to find entire villages gone. No answers, just fear and funerals, dental care. Ha! People chewed through rock-hard bread and never brushed their teeth. Tooth decay was so common that dentists didn't need appointments. They just waited to hear the screams echoing through the village. And the so-called medications often did more harm than good. Got a rash? Here's some mercury. Yes, the poison. Have syphilis? More mercury. The side effects weren't dry mouth or drowsiness. They were death. Faster than the disease could manage. Worst of all, hygiene was a foreign concept. No hand sanitizer, no soap. Just people wiping their filthy hands on even filthier clothes. So let's recap. You're bleeding out, covered in lice, chewing stone bread, and your only doctor's wearing a robe and waving leeches around like it's a magic trick. And somehow, you're still expected to show up for work in the morning. In the Middle Ages, justice wasn't blind, it was insane. The law depended on where you stood, literally. Walk 5 miles, and what was legal in your village could get you executed. In the next one. No universal laws, no read your rights, just pain and prayers. Get caught stealing bread to survive? You might lose your hand, chop down a tree in the king's forest, death penalty, petty theft, also death. In fact, medieval England had over 200 crimes that could legally end with your neck in a noose. And trials? Oh, they were a whole other circus. If you were accused, forget lawyers. Forget evidence. Your defense was basically, I swear I didn't do it, followed by something called a trial by ordeal. One popular method? Walk 9 feet while holding a red-hot iron bar. If your burns healed within 3 days, you were innocent. If not, guilty. And good luck with that healing, considering infections were practically a death sentence. Another favorite? Trial by water. You'd get tied up and tossed into a river. If you sank, you were innocent, but probably dead. If you floated, you were guilty, and would be executed. Yeah, float, charge a witch, sink, charge a corpse. Lose-lose. The logic? Water was pure, and it would reject evil. Clearly not science, but it sure made for good public entertainment. And when punishment came, it was loud, public, and theatrical. Hanging was considered merciful. For the worst crimes, like treason, you'd be drawn and quartered, dragged through the streets, partially, hanged, disemboweled alive, then beheaded and chopped into 4 pieces. Fun for the whole family. Crowds would gather like it was game day, snacks in hand, kids in tow. Because when Netflix didn't exist, watching someone get dismembered was the next best thing. But if you were rich, different rules. Nobles could request trial by combat, sometimes hiring professionals to fight for them. They could also pay blood money to victims' families and skip the pain entirely. Justice was brutal, unless you had money. Then it was negotiable. As for prisons, forget. Long-term jail time. Dungeons were just holding tanks, dark, overcrowded pits where prisoners were chained to walls, starving, rotting, and waiting to be tortured. Oh yes, torture wasn't just punishment, it was part of the legal process. Devices like the rack, which stretched your limbs until they popped. Thumbscrews and the dreaded Iron Maiden were used to extract confessions. True or false didn't matter. You talked to stop the pain, and then they killed you anyway. Even minor crimes had humiliating punishments. Locked in stocks, you'd sit in the town square with your head and hands trapped while strangers threw mud, rotten food, and worse at you. Women accused of gossiping or nagging could be tied to a ducking stool and dunked underwater until they learned their lesson. And law enforcement? Laughable. Towns hired night watchmen, usually old men with bad hearing and no weapons. Their job? Yell, "Stop, thief," and hope someone else tripped the criminal. That was the entire police force, and if you were accused, forget innocent until proven guilty. In medieval times, it was more like, you're guilty, prove you're not, while bleeding. Forget the movies. Medieval warfare wasn't glorious. It wasn't noble. It was a blood-soaked nightmare, and if you were a commoner, it didn't even matter which side you were on. You were cannon fodder with no cannons. War was constant. During the so-called 100 Years' War between England and France, fighting dragged on for 116 years. Generations were born, lived, and died under the shadow of endless conflict. And if you lived in medieval Europe, war wasn't something far away. It was your backyard, your field, your food supply, burning. Let's talk armor. Full plate armor, the shiny stuff knights wore, was outrageously expensive. the price of a modern sports car, and it took 2 or 3 years' worth of wages for a skilled craftsman to buy a full set. Most soldiers didn't get that. They wore padded cloth, maybe with a few metal scraps sewn on, and prayed the arrows missed. And swords? Also expensive. Real battlefield weapons for commoners were spears, axes, or just sharpened farm tools. If you were lucky, you had something with a point. If not, you swung what you had and hoped not to die first. The most feared weapon? The English longbow. It could pierce armor from a distance, and archers trained from childhood, pulling 200-pound bows so often their bones literally grew deformed. Think about that. Kids becoming living weapons, their skeletons reshaped by war, and the death toll? Massive. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, nearly 28,000 men died in a single day. That was 1% of England's male population, and some of them froze to death before they even reached the battlefield. But for peasants, the worst part wasn't the fighting. It was what happened in between. Medieval armies didn't carry rations. They lived off the land, which meant stealing, looting, burning crops, killing livestock, and destroying homes in every village they passed. Didn't matter whose side you were on, you were getting robbed either way. The medieval version of "support our troops" meant "please don't torch our barn." And then came sieges, where armies surrounded a castle or town, cutting off supplies and waiting for people inside to starve. These weren't short. Some sieges lasted months, even years. During the siege of Paris in 885, people resorted to eating rats, cats, and eventually, each other. The longest siege in recorded history? The siege of Candia, 21 years. That's not a battle. That's a lifetime. And if disease hadn't killed you yet, war would finish the job. Armies were the perfect petri dishes, thousands of men packed into filthy camps, sharing bad food and worse water. In the Crusades, half the soldiers died from illness before they even reached the battlefield. Medieval medicine? Useless. If you were wounded, your 2 options were: rub some dirt on it, prepare to meet your maker, and civilians? No safer. Villages were wiped out. Women, children, no one was spared. If you fled, you starved. If you stayed, you burned. It wasn't war. It was a plague with swords. So if you somehow managed to survive a medieval war, congratulations. You were probably starving, homeless, sick. And your town was gone. Let's say you dodged war, disease, torture, and starvation. Congrats. Now you get to live. And it's still horrible. The first thing that would hit you in any medieval town wasn't the people, it was the stench. Cities reeked of human waste, rotting food, slaughterhouse guts, tanning chemicals, and thick clouds of smoke. Garbage wasn't collected. It was thrown in the street or into the river. Butchers dumped animal entrails right outside their shops. The air was so foul that people carried tiny bags of herbs, called pomanders, just to not throw up walking, to work. And that was just the smell. Personal hygiene? Non-existent. Bathing was rare. Most people washed just a few times a year, usually in spring and again before winter. Why so little? Because many believed bathing opened your pores and let in disease. Imagine going 5 months without washing, and then sharing a bed with your whole family. Lice were normal. People had special combs to get rid of them, and if you only had a moderate lice infestation, that was considered clean. Medieval dating profiles would have said, "Good teeth, barely smells, owns a lice comb." Clothing didn't help. Everyone wore the same rough, itchy garments until they fell apart. Undergarments were made of coarse linen that scraped your skin raw, and outerwear was thick wool that never stopped itching. Most people owned only 2 or 3 outfits total, and yes, that included the rich. Shoes? Don't even bother. They were flat, thin pieces of leather that gave you no protection from cold, mud, or sewage-filled streets. Walking barefoot might have been cleaner, and even if you survived all that, good luck talking to anyone. The English spoken back then, Middle English, sounds like an alien language. A simple sentence like, "What's your name?" was, "Wyatt is thy nama." You'd sound like a time traveler with a concussion. People wouldn't just stare. They'd probably think you were possessed. Privacy doesn't exist. Most homes were one room where the entire family ate, worked, and slept together. And if you traveled, inns often forced strangers to share beds. Yes, literal bed sharing with sweaty, lice-covered strangers who hadn't bathed since the last harvest. Cozy, even. Wealthy homes weren't safe. Servants were always around, even during private moments. You couldn't even die with dignity. As for entertainment, it was either public executions, animal cruelty, or listening to some guy tell the same story he told last year, badly. And no, you couldn't just work hard and move up. The feudal system locked everyone in their place. About 90% of people were peasants, born poor, died poor, and owned nothing but back pain. Climbing the social ladder? There was no ladder, just a ditch you worked in until death. The rest of life was filled with superstition. People believed in witches, demons, and astrology. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into mass hysteria. And news? It traveled at the speed of a guy walking on muddy roads. If something happened 50 miles away, you'd hear about it next month. So yeah, no deodorant, no privacy, no Google, no freedom, just filth, fear, and a lice comb you had to share with your cousin. So here you are, alive, somehow, after dodging poisoned bread, airborne sewage, torture trials, plague doctors, and lice-infested bedmates. But at this point, even the strongest modern human would be on their knees, begging to go back to Wi-Fi, toothpaste, and takeout. Because medieval life wasn't just hard, it was relentlessly cruel, filthy, and depressingly hopeless. No rights. No health, no choice. You worked yourself into the dirt, then you died in it. And not quietly. Probably from an infected blister, a bad winter, or an execution for accidentally cutting down the wrong tree. We romanticize it now, knights in shining armor, fair maidens in castles, magical forests. But the truth is, you would have never made it past breakfast. Your food, rotting, your drink, dangerous, your bathroom, a bucket under a straw mattress, your job, manual labor until your body broke, your doctor, a guy with a knife and a jar of leeches, your future, basically none. Even surviving a single 24 hours in medieval times would have been a miracle. And yet, millions of people did it every day, generation after generation. They endured a world that gave them nothing, and still somehow built the foundations of what we enjoy today. So the next time you complain about slow internet, burnt coffee, or long work emails, just remember, in the Middle Ages, you'd be walking barefoot through sewage with a lice comb in one hand and a pint of weak beer in the other, at age 6.